guess there's not very many of us here. Hey, you guys, thanks for coming this morning to the fake news seminar, where it's a little bit different than what you've seen here at the Offshore Alert Conference so far this week. I'm Gina Smith. I'm a longtime journalist. David Mickelson is the founder of Snopes. He's next to me. Snopes started out as a site to note conspiracy theories, but now during the Trump campaign, I think every journalist in the world would go right to Snopes after anything was said, because their fact-checking is some of the best in the world, really. Bethania Palma is a reporter there. So we've been talking about this. I would love to minimize slides and really maximize your commentary. So if you've got questions, comments, things you want to add or whatever, it's a small group. Just shout it out, and I'll make sure you're heard, and we'll talk about it. Fake news. You know, we were just trying to come up with some examples of fake news that maybe you hadn't heard. And what was the story, David? It was back in October 2015, a website called Real News Right Now. It's a humor site. It did a piece that said that Obama was letting in 250,000 Syrian immigrants, and he was going to put them on Indian land, on native lands in Arizona, and then make them build a pipeline. No. But he's going to bring them in there, and it was kind of a crazy story. It wasn't created to be fake news. It was a humor site. The story that ran directly opposite was a story about the Vatican beginning nuclear testing, right? So this is, it wasn't created to be, it's a satire site, Real News Right Now. 2 weeks later, Sean Hannity, the conservative radio host, was on Fox TV and mentioned it in passing on Fox TV. And 2 weeks after that, he had Donald Trump for the very first time on his radio show and mentioned it to Trump. Trump began feverishly tweeting about, is Obama insane? Why is he doing it? A couple of weeks later, Trump was on the Today Show, mentioned it to Matt Lauer. NBC didn't question the story. In fact, NBC wrote stories about Trump's reaction to Obama's decision to bring 250,000 Syrian immigrants to Indian land. A week after that, Ben Carson and Carly Fiorina made it this fake fact the center point of their stances on immigration and why they were so against it. And Snopes debunked it, Washington Post debunked it, everyone debunked it. It didn't matter. To this day, it's one of the most liked and shared stories on Facebook. Something like 25 million shares. And when you go out to the Midwest and ask people about immigration, they'll say, well, why would you want Hillary or anyone allied with Trump? Don't you know they were going to bring all those potential ISIS terrorists here? But it started at a humor site.
It's one of the aspects of the weaponization of fake news that sites don't just run a fake news story. They essentially farm it out to a network of related sites, and then it gets aggregated by other independent sites. It gets mentioned by talk radio, television hosts. It gets embedded in the audience's mind as a fact. And then when a week or two later, somebody finally says, hey, this came from a humor site, or this came from a fake news site, it has little effect. Everybody's moved on. It's already in their head that, yes, we're sending 250,000 Syrian refugees to Navajo land in North Dakota and Arizona. Let's move on to the next issue.
Yeah, it becomes known. But that's a story, that's an innocent story in a way. It started as a humor site. You're like, well, such is the internet, such is social networking. It often a fake news story, and we'll have to redefine that word fake news in a couple minutes. It'll start a little more malevolently. You had an example from North Korea, Bethania.
Yeah, there was a story that started spreading around. It was picked up by a tabloid called Daily Star, and then it was picked up by
It was last week.
Yeah, and then it was picked up by a bunch of shady websites like Zero Hedge and a couple of others. I can't remember, but basically somebody had taken a YouTube video of a tsunami alarm going off in Chile 2015 after a large earthquake, and they repurposed the video and they relabeled it. They put it online a little grainier, and it says something like Pyongyang evacuates 600,000 residents over nuclear fears. And this was coupled with, recent news of the U.S. sending a naval strike group to the Korean Peninsula and sort of the heightened tensions. So this was sort of a classic example of, sort of more malevolent fake news and how it spreads, because it started in a Russian publication called Pravda, and the same day that it's Pravda.
But not Pravda, not the real Pravda, the fake news Pravda. There are two Pravdas now.
It wasn't the paper Pravda, it was the online Pravda, pravda.ru. And then after, so the same day that it was on Pravda, it was also on YouTube, and then it spread through all these shady websites. And then we found the original video online, and there are actually a whole bunch of videos from this earthquake and the aftermath, and if you know where the original incident was, you can find it easily, because it was put online by a number of residents. I think it was Valparaiso, Chile, but that was a good example of how it's
somebody purposely found the tsunami alarm and said, let's
spread some paranoia, yeah.
So all these stories give us a good jumping off point, I think, here, because, beyond just talking about, well, what is fake news, I think we all know it when we see it, like porn. It's kind of information porn in a way. But beyond that, how does it spread? How does it start? I mean, certainly conspiracy theories aren't new. You guys started in the mid-'90s debunking urban legend. I mean, why is it still going on after the campaign? Why is it so bad? Is there a way to stop it? Does it move markets? Does it move elections? And, what to do? You made a point to me last night, and I thought it was an excellent one. It used to be, I used to work for ABC News in the 90s, and there were only 3 networks, plus CNN at the time. Everybody more or less heard the same stories, right, on TV. A few major newspapers, that's it. Now, pretty much, pardon the word, any idiot, including me, can create a news site that's a special interest narrowcast, and people are, is that it, David? Are they just eating their own dog food? I mean...
Well, one of the issues that's been raised quite recently in the aftermath of the election is whether what we call fake news very broadly influenced the outcome of the election. And one of the issues that I deal with is that fake news is really kind of a symptom, not the disease. As Gina was saying, back in the days of like Walter Cronkite, we had 3 networks who did an hour of news each night. Everybody was pretty much hearing and seeing the same news. Now with narrowcasting, you can watch a conservative news channel, a liberal news channel, something in between. You can only be exposed to the kind of news you want to hear, the kind that reports things you're already inclined to believe in. So we're seeing an increase in political polarization, where there's just less and less common ground between conservative and liberal, Democrat and Republican. And so fake news is an aspect of that, but it's kind of, the larger issue is people aren't being exposed to information that's contrary to what they're already inclined to believe. They're not seeing opposing viewpoints. They're not being exposed to discussions about alternatives. So,
okay. Something's different, though. I mean, it's been around forever, right? I mean, fake news, National Enquirer. But
yes.
Something's different now about it.
Well, it's also, National Enquirer was always very distinct from the real news media. It was a tabloid, it wasn't a newspaper. But now, with the internet, there's a whole lot of blurring of what is a news outlet. I mean, it can be you know, as we're often accused of being like two people and a cat, or, you know, or it can be the New York Times, and it's often hard to tell the difference between who's actually reporting and who's just making stuff up.
And you know this is another issue too, right, Bithynia? Like you mentioned, there's the Pravda propaganda paper, then there's the fake Pravda website. The average person, I see Pravda.ru, I don't know that it's not Pravda, it's Russian, it's called Pravda, I mean, come on. But there are sites called, isn't there a CNN.co? And
ABC.co, those are fake. Yeah.
So, and people are making money off this, yes? And they're making money by what? The advertising networks.
Yes.
The web click, the clicks that they're getting. And so, I mean, I was kind of, I think maybe you were referencing last night, I was saying that there's now this void of information because of the collapse of the newspaper industry. And I was talking about how, because I used to work for newspapers as a reporter, and with newspapers, there's a certain organization of information. Like you'll get your lead, you'll get your nut graph, and then you stack the information from the most pertinent to kind of the least pertinent. But it's all vetted. And when you read a newspaper, you can see how the reporter makes their case for the story that they're laying out. They're not, this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is all cited. Everything is cited. So I believe
every
that
comment in the story in the old days, right? It has some kind of a reference to it.
Yeah,
right? He said it.
Yeah, so I think that people were conditioned to, everybody read newspapers, so people were conditioned to, expect information to be vetted that way. Now that there's not many newspapers and not many newspaper readers, I think that people are not accustomed to expecting information to be properly vetted. So they look at a website, there's some words, it's on a website, it must be true,
And we also, of course, older people like myself that grew up in the era of network news and newspapers, but we now have a whole generation of people who have grown up perhaps not ever having obtained news from anywhere other than the internet, or even more specifically, social media, so they don't recognize the contrast that Bithynia was speaking of, that this isn't like how real newspapers put out stories, because they haven't ever read real newspapers.
We have a question right in front of our comment.
How important is the craft of
I would say not very important. If you see a lot of it, it looks very shoddy.
Yeah.
Well, it looks shoddy to our eyes, though, as journalists. Like, I look at it and I'm like, oh, God, this is clearly fake. They didn't quote anyone. But to the average person who's not reading the story, what are they doing? They're on Facebook, right? They're looking at,
They look at the headline.
They're looking at a headline and maybe
Image.
50 characters, 100 characters?
Yeah. But in some ways that works to their advantage, like the Drudge Report, for example, is very visually unappealing. It kind of reinforces the image of we're the outsiders giving you the news that the mainstream media won't tell you about. So we're running on the... Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I mean, they make it like a news story, and to the average eye, what does that look like? President Obama today announced that 250,000 Syrian refugees, according to the BBC, right? I mean, they can make it sound that way, and that's, I think, extremely important. What makes it not look like news to us is we're used to seeing people be quoted, right? And it's the most outrageous thing that Obama has ever done. But there's no quotes around it, and it doesn't say anyone said it. And someone like us, we look at it and go, "Oh, that's clearly fake."
I just wondered, the example you mentioned, with the Syrian refugees, it's not like Jesus came from space or something like that. It's 250, it's a plausible number. It's not unreasonable. To assume that it's wrong.
And also, when you hear it on the radio, and then this is before everybody knew about Trump's tweeting, and then all the Republican candidates start repeating it, and then Matt Lauer's on the Today Show questioning Trump about it. So what you're really upset about, sir, is the 250,000 Syrian, I mean, you don't blame America for buying into this when everybody's treating it as if it's true.
Well, I often say that a large part of the fake news problem is an audience problem, because, of course, anyone can go out and buy a WordPress template and have a very professional-looking site set up in a day or two and look like a news organization. And they do, as you mentioned, go to a lot of effort to actually craft news-like articles that are rich in detail. But there are other sites that just throw together something cheap, and their stories are like 4 sentences long, and they still get a tremendous amount of attention from an audience that isn't discerning or distinguishing between the two, and possibly doesn't care. I mean, like the Daily Mail in the UK is probably, I think,
a great example.
Is the single largest news entity on the internet in terms of traffic. They frequently get stories wrong.
They're often sued.
And when they're debunked, they don't correct them. The stories have been up on the site for years, and it doesn't seem to impact their readership. It's not like people are leaving in droves and visiting other sites because the Daily Mail keeps getting stuff wrong. Readers just don't care a lot about credibility. They care about interesting stories.
Somebody, I think it was you last night, made a point last night that is it readers, is it viewers being kind of addicted to the adrenaline of reading shocking stuff? Like, is that a part of it where people, or just they want to believe the stuff that they see online, even if it's outrageous? They're like, yes. Spirit cooking. I don't know if you guys heard this, but about Podesta supposedly being a Satanist, and it was released in WikiLeaks, and it was a crazy story, but it was everywhere.
Yeah, it's confirmation bias, I think, because social media has allowed people to kind of build their own bubble of their own, political views, and only see because they can like certain pages and not like certain pages, and keep some friends and not other friends, and so they can create a Facebook page for themselves that they look at all the time that only has news sources that come from a certain, political leaning, and it's right and left. It's not just
for sure there are liberal fake news. It's just not quite as insidious. But I'm thinking,
it might be later down the line,
like the Palmer Report.
Well, the problem with them is, they just take information that hasn't really been fully vetted or reported out, and they just throw it up online and see, here's my conspiracy theory. And
so what the Palmer Report does, it's a liberal site, but it's not that they're creating Podesta is a Satanist, but what they do is they float a trial balloon. So, for instance, maybe you believe that Trump has organized crime ties. I mean, it's never been proven for sure. But they might do a story that says, Trump's organized crime ties are the reason he wants to build the wall. Yeah. And then at the very end, they'll end with a question, right? Yeah. Don't you think? And no quote, but people see it, they want to believe it, and they're like, tweet, retweet, like.
Palmer Report gets a lot of traction, yeah. They get a lot of traction because it's very salacious, but it's also that can be insidious too.
Well, it's also a lot of the audience likes politics to be black and white, good or bad, right or wrong.
Right. My site's right, your site's wrong.
There's a lot of politics is all about nuance and gray areas and compromise and details, and that just doesn't appeal to a lot of readers. They want to see, Obama is a traitor, Trump is corrupt, very simple, catchy things that they can understand and believe in. Not read a whole lot of detail about a possible connection between a server sitting in a basement somewhere and a server in a Russian bank somewhere.
Right. The Alpha Banks.
And all the details of communication over the internet.
And just leaving it right here, one might be tempted to say, well, so what, right? People are stupid. The internet is full of junk, whatever, fake news. Let's go to the panel over there about rich spouses hiding money offshore in divorces, and you could almost be forgiven for thinking this at this point. However, when it moves markets, when it may influence violence or voting, and it's not getting better, is it?
No, I don't think it's getting better.
Well, I said one good example might be all of the news in the last year or two about the Dakota Access Pipeline, with both sides, I wouldn't say putting out fake news necessarily, but certainly there were a lot of information was coming out from, should we say, like fronts that, PR firms sort of masquerading as independent fact checkers, and a lot of information where the true source of it was obscured to try and influence public opinion on one side or the other.
So what's the answer? I mean, you had an example too of Russian fake news writers trying to destabilize U.S.
Yeah, I think that
stock value.
Well, that was testimony during the Senate intelligence hearing. That one of the experts that testified said that some of the fake news that they've generated has actually resulted in stock prices moving like in a negative direction. But yeah, that's definitely like an aspect of it. The last election, but it didn't just start there. Their goal is sort of destabilization. When I'm talking about them, I say, I'm talking about the Russians. Like their goal is to sort of destabilize right now the Western democracies from the inside out, because they don't have really the strength to do it militarily. So what do is they attack our internal weaknesses, and that's kind of one of the purposes of what we're calling fake news right now.
Right.
So
even the term fake news is now fake news.
Yeah.
You were making this point last night. Why shouldn't we use the word? Even using the word is harming.
Yeah, even like as recently, say a year ago, we were using fake news in a very narrow sense just to describe those sites that put out ridiculous stories like, woman has sex with family dog, gives birth to litter of puppies, just...
Or Queen Elizabeth is a reptile or a reptilian.
But now,
crazy stuff.
with the election, it's expanded to include everything from just bad journalism to hyper-partisanism and propaganda, conspiracy theory, satire, both good and bad, hoaxes, and then now our current president branding CNN and the New York Times and others as fake news. So now it's just kind of just this general pejorative that anything.
So how should we, if we think of it, because language does dictate like how you look at stuff. I mean, should we think of it as weaponized news or just crap information or?
I mean, some of it's just straight up propaganda. That's an important distinction, I think. And then, there's always the conspiracy theory, and a lot of those people are just in it for the profit, but they can be used for... The problem is if you don't have any... if you don't care about facts and you don't care about being credible, and you just have an audience that believes whatever you say no matter what, like there's lizard people that control the world, you can... Yeah,
have you guys heard of the reptilian thing we're referring to? There's a...
It's probably one of the more popular and bizarre conspiracy theories, but if you don't have any consideration for facts, then you can be used for any purpose because facts don't matter, so...
So, go ahead.
Is there any evidence that fake news actually
Yeah.
life where you used to get the second
Well, one of the examples I usually cite is the studies where they're trying to measure, like, is fake news contributing to this political polarization? And they measured different demographic groups and found that this polarization was occurring most strongly among people who were like 75 years and older, who are the people least likely to be using social media and least likely to be exposed to fake news.
That's interesting.
Which is why I tend to describe it as it's just a symptom of a lot of larger things that are going on. It's not in itself what's driving things or what's causing the changes we're seeing. It's just one aspect of it.
Yeah, but however, I've spent the last 20 years living in San Francisco, and a year ago I moved out to Tulsa, Oklahoma for a project. And I'd go to San Francisco during the course of the election, and I'd say, wow, Trump could win. And they'd go, what? Never. That's not real. Nobody's really for Trump. At where I was, nobody believed that anybody wouldn't be for Trump. And they're reading, well, like you say, they're in an echo chamber, right?
Yes.
And they're reading all the things, and they're like, well, Gina, how could we vote for Hillary? Because she sold 3/4 of the U.S.'s uranium to Russia. To Russia. And I'm like, the Secretary of State doesn't sell uranium. How can she do that? But they read it everywhere, and the liberal bias in reverse was true too, with what I heard in San Francisco. So, but evidence, I think there's evidence so far as getting out of politics for a second. Ashley Madison, you guys remember that story? Ashley Madison was supposedly an adulterous dating site. Well, it wasn't a dating site. It was a front for escort services and hookers. And it was never like I want to have an affair and so you sign up, and it was never that. They had about 65 different sites for all kinds of sexual predilections like bondage and, et cetera. And they were just matching people with hookers in the area. But how did they do this? They went to Daily Mail and all these papers, and they purchased native advertising. They purchased space that it looks like editorial, but it's not. And people believed it. So when they floated a fake story that they were going public, people believed it, and they raised a ton of money. Because they'd seen all these newspaper articles that there's a real website, but it was all fake. So for sure, it can move markets. Question?
It's not a question about I work
Yeah, that is an excellent point she brings in, because it is typical for you to blame, well, people are stupid, or the internet is divided, but really the information providers largely have the responsibility, right? And by information providers, I mean part of the problem, as you were saying, is now that there's fake media that looks real, right? There's the Pravda RU versus Pravda, or abc.co versus abcnews.com. So that is a problem in terms of it. But still, what about Twitter? What about Facebook? Facebook, the big story you were showing us in the paper today, Facebook will say, we're not news, but they are providing a platform, you know, and
My question is because clearly this talk about carefree education. I mean, I need to know what the media can be doing.
yeah, well, I would say the media is not doing enough, which is why you guys exist. Snopes and PolitiFact, I mean, they do nothing but debunk stuff.
Wow, because I think really what is happening is that nobody's trusting
Yeah.
whatever kind it is. Because as a customer,
The problem.
it's on TV, you know, somewhere, and it's information. And all that's when it's about you, when it's about somebody else. You don't know.
How to gain back credibility. It's an
Well,
excellent point.
I suppose one approach, I don't know if we'll ever see it, is that news sort of moved from being more of a public service to much more of an entertainment business.
And that's been happening for the last 30
Yeah,
years.
and of course, there's always been pressure to be first with the story. The common cliche of the hatted reporter with the camera trying to get a scoop so he can run in and yell, "Stop the presses!" But of course, now, where a lot of news is consumed online, just being 5 minutes slower than one of your competitors can make a huge difference. And so a lot of stuff goes up before all the details are correct. And when people hear the initial stories, those details get stuck in their mind, and later corrections don't ever dislodge them. And there's, I don't know if I can think of any off my head, but there's a whole lot of stories during the election cycle where, what was initially reported was actually not really the actual story, but people still had the initial reporting stuck in their heads. And
This is a problem with everybody trying, you brought this up with corporate interests. This is corporate-owned media trying to, make a dollar, trying to get lots of hits, trying to gain SEO.
As we're starting to see, with the Wiki Tribune, people trying to sort of crowdsource or find alternative funding for news outlets. So it's not.
Have you guys heard of Wiki Tribune? Do you know what it is?
Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, trying to kind of do the same thing for news, but the idea of trying to get it away from being, a business-driven entertainment and just a service, a public service. I don't know if we'll get there.
Yeah. Hopefully, we have a question, a comment, and then back there.
If you're a journalist, you never write the truth. No, because you cannot present the whole picture. You can only
Hey, you have 15 column images, yeah.
you can only present information where that is confirmed by a source. Here we have a source, but they present opinion.
Yeah.
Which is why you used to have to take two of them.
One opinion, but not the other.
Right.
So we're presenting facts. We're not presenting. It's there's a lot of sausage making going on when you're trying to do something, and it's true that the news media sort of contribute to its own downfall because They founded organizations which looked like they had some credibility. Blatantly in favor of what this corporation needs. But it's
Well, we were, you should never just have one source, though. I mean, if you should have multiple sources.
But then what you have contributed to what we have now. We have extreme opinions,
Yeah.
none of which are true. And the reader has to sort of find out between both extreme opinions that the truth is actually somewhere in the middle.
I
And
think
that's
that's a
how
good
it
point.
used to be.
The rise of partisan media is a huge problem for sure.
Paramedia, we call it.
Although,
Paramedia?
Paramedia is the partisan
Which,
media.
I mean, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I would never use Twitter for a news story on television.
yeah.
Time pressures and stuff like that. But to me, Twitter is not fact. Twitter is the star.
Yeah.
You cannot cite anything.
Well, part of that's an inherent issue with news reporting is often when we write some long, detailed analysis of something, we'll get cranky comments from readers saying, I just want to know if this is true or not. I don't want to have to read a bunch of stuff. Can't you just give us the facts? But facts have little or no meaning without some
Context.
analysis or interpretation or context, because I could report 23 people died in Miami yesterday. What does that mean? I mean, did they all die in a drive-by shooting? Did they die of an Ebola outbreak? Was it 23 completely unrelated
murdered?
natural
Yeah.
cause deaths? I mean, you have to put you do have to provide some interpretation and context to facts. So it has to be subjective to some degree.
It's always been squishy. I mean, you go to the Society for Professional Journalists, and they're the watchdogs, or they have been historically, of ethics. They'll tell you journalists strive for objectivity and they strive for accuracy, and that's supposed to be good journalism. You had a comment, I know, directly to his, and then I have you.
I want to say that what is the most efficient way? But they say, oh, but this is my opinion, but you don't really have to like turn on forever.
It's true. I worked at ABC News in the 90s after the JonBenet Ramsey and the little girl that was murdered, and there was no new news in this case. I mean, there were no suspects, nothing. We did a JonBenet piece probably 3 or 4 times a week, and the reporters would be like, "What's up with this?" Well, the viewers want it, but there is no news, and it was beginning with like OJ and everybody staring at a white Bronco driving slowly, in LA. Like, we became used to this idea as news, as entertainment. I think this is, problem one.
Well, that's another one of the significant changes we've seen in news. They said when you had an hour per night on network news, it was pretty much limited to reporting what happened. Now we have cable news networks that are on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have internet where you're not limited by print, by distribution in a physical medium. You have to fill up all that space with something, and there's just not enough news that's of interest to viewers and readers to fill all that space. So we get a lot of commentary, analysis, discussion, criticism, talking heads, and things that really aren't news at all.
They want hits.
Yeah, and you also have the collapse of the local news industry as well, like local newspapers, and I think that's a big problem with what you were talking about. With you were saying reporters can't fly, which is true. But what if there were reporters, in communities where they didn't have to fly and they were actually covering the communities?
There used to be. Like I
Well,
worked
that's
at
the thing.
ABC, we had local ABC
Yeah.
stations everywhere, and we could call them and say, oh,
Yeah.
there was just a disaster, run to it.
Yeah.
The journalism's been
Well, I
covered.
always wonder too. I mean, there was so much talk about, the coal industry collapsed, and these people are looking at the presidential election as their savior. But I always wonder, are there newspapers in this community? What are the local officials doing to bring jobs to these areas where the industry collapsed? Because I assume there's a lot of, just from my own experience as a local news reporter, there's probably a lot of municipal and local government inaction, complacency, corruption even, So that to me is more of a local issue than it is an issue of the presidential election.
And they're even seeking hits, right? The local papers. So there's no benefit in doing a story on like the sewage commission and who's, all this.
But that's the job of the local newspaper reporter, though. You have a you should have a reporter in every city hall,
That's
But
right. At every meeting, and every P&Z meeting,
Yeah,
and
but I
planning and
mean-
zoning meeting, and all of it.
yeah.
This is you've good. Yeah, so what are the economics? How do people make money off fake news generally? And is Google's plan an ideal one?
Well, yeah, for the most part, fake news is getting money from online advertising, which is unfortunately the same place that we get our revenue from. So there's been a
So
lot
if I start a fake news site and I want to make some money, how do I do? So I create the story, and then what? The more people like it and share it on Google and Facebook, then I make money based on the ads.
Generally, you set up the site first so it looks like it's a real credible site, sign up with an advertising network, and then you start posting the stuff that will get you millions of views and likes and shares. But there's been a lot of effort to try and get companies like Google, who control a lot of online advertising, to cut off advertising to fake news sites, both to disincentivize them and to free up more advertising revenue for real journalism and fact-checking sites like ours, since we're all competing for pieces of that same pie. But they're, unless fake news is in the employ, like they're working as a state agent or there's some business interest behind them, they generally aren't funded in any way other than online advertising. But one really good viral story could make several $1,000s in one day. And, it takes a few days for the debunking to get around, and by then everybody's seen the story, so it doesn't hurt them.
And we were talking last night about that effort. So you go to Breitbart or Red State or one of these websites, say they're doing a story about white supremacists or something heinous like that, and then you see a Nike ad next to it. And there is an organization now that's, they contact Nike, they do this whole social campaign around it. Nike, are you aware that your ad is right across the street from the story about the Klan or whatever? And often Nike, they have no idea.
Yeah, but they're waking up to the fact now, and they actually
Yeah.
they have no control over their ads. Yes, which is not really what you want in an advertising.
No.
Right. And I guess the box isn't checked anymore automatically, as you were saying yesterday, right?
Well, at one point, Breitbart was complaining that, some of the agencies were no longer including them in ad buys, and it wasn't really the case that they were being boxed out. It was just they were no longer selected by default, that the advertiser had to go in and click the box to say, yes, I want to be on Breitbart. But that gets into the whole issue of there have been legislative efforts to try and address fake news, but it's very difficult to try and draw a line between fake news and what's covered by freedom of speech, because freedom of speech includes lying. It's not a crime. You have a right to lie too, as long as it's not fraud or libel. So, whenever we start trying to cut off advertising to things or limit what you can put on the internet or what Facebook can spread, you get into that very slippery slope about, what's fake news and what's just cutting off news that you don't like because it's too partisan for your tastes.
So do Google and Facebook make a great deal of money off the fact that everybody is over the success of fake news? Absolutely. So it's not in their interest at all to cut back on fake news. Like you were mentioning Facebook the other day, which said, well, we're not going to run as many of these fake news stories. And when I go to San Francisco and look at my Facebook, I don't see as many. But when I'm back in Oklahoma, they're all there. I mean, are they just narrowcasting the fake news?
Well, some of it could be geo-targeted, I guess.
Yeah. Oh. You become richer than if you're just a regular journalist.
Well,
I can attest to that.
I mean, well, yeah. Although, of course, they have low operating costs. I mean, unless you're stopped working and devoting yourself full time to running a fake news site, you can just, pop out a few stories a day around your regular job and pay very little for hosting, and any money you make is profit, really, even if it's not thousands of dollars. I mean, when we started, I think our first check was for like $16. I was quite excited that, wow, I made money working for myself. But I said a lot of them just trudge along until they, get the one hit a big story that suddenly, several 100,000 shares in the space of a day or two. That's a month's worth of work at a good job for some of them.
I'd also disagree with that premise as well, because there's also some very profitable operations. Maybe they're not what we think of right now as fake news, but they're kind of the old, like conspiracy theorists, like the InfoWars, Alex Jones' InfoWars. They are very profitable, and
he's made a ton of money off this, and he makes up UFO stuff on the radio.
He said Lady Gaga was going to perform a satanic ritual during the Super Bowl, so but and there's also
Pizzagate, right?
Pizzagate,
there's sex ring.
Well,
but nobody sees these apologies. It's like errata in the newspaper, like the New York Times, and then the next day they'll run, we were incorrect about XYZ, but many more people see a story than the errata.
But there's also that David Icke guy. That guy gives like conferences and stuff like that, and he makes a killing off that lizard theory thing. So
the reptilian theory.
Many examples of people get paid by
What's the question?
The question is, do we know of any...
of people getting paid by interest groups for writing?
Well,
you have an answer for that? Yeah, you were going to say...
Well, again, it depends what we're calling fake news. As I said, during the whole Dakota Access Pipeline issue with the Native Americans, there were sites that called themselves, fact-checking the, Dakota Access Pipeline issue, and they were really tied to PR companies who were working for, the pipeline company. They weren't independent fact checkers by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, and think also about Breitbart and about Hannity. Sean Hannity, the conservative radio host, both of them on Donald Trump's payroll. This was public. They both were getting salaries from the campaign. They were making money for sure based on the kind of coverage, and they were both so guilty of repeating the craziest, nuttiest things during the election.
And then there's also, there's like RT and Sputnik, those are state funded, so I don't know what their books look like, but.
You guys know about RT and Sputnik? They're Russian propaganda.
RT used to be Russia Today, but they're both Russian state-funded news outlets that broadcast in the U.S. on the internet.
And they'll sometimes post stories that are completely fake, and then they'll pull the story. So it's already out there and circulating, and then they pull it offline so that, I guess they think that's plausible deniability, but.
Well, and then there's the whole native advertising thing, back to the Ashley Madison thing. I thought, why, God, how many media outlets, Daily Mail Online, that big one in Canada too, I mean, how much money did Ashley Madison, or Avid, which owns Ashley Madison, pay them to run these crazy stories like, which city has the most affairs, what restaurant, it was all just fake stuff because they weren't really a dating site. They were paying people, so people were making money off that stuff, but maybe the payment's not as direct and it's hard to follow the money. Cool, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
That improves things.
I have something because for Japanese TV, we were covering exactly what is fake news because and Trump, one of the, I forgot the conference room, they pointed out it's a fake news. So that made us feel, what is fake news in America? So what we wanted to approach was that, what is the other side think about it? So we booked a couple of the people from the fake news, like Brightburn. One of the journalists called Pamela Geller. I don't know if you know
Oh,
it.
yeah.
But, so we interviewed her. I interviewed her. And it was very interesting because she said, of course, New York Times, CBS, they're fake news. And her word was animedia. It's called anime media. And she said, animedia. And she pointed out, but I knew she was reading all the news that it's on. And I really feel like it's important to have a balance. I'm not saying they're good or they're bad. Some of the news are totally wrong, in my opinion. But if there is one media that's, as I said, it's back in like a, we can multiply. So what I wanted to say is that even them knows what we were doing. And so I think the balance is very important. And she makes money. She didn't really articulate about that, but most of the people who write in that the website is freelancing. There are really few people who works for the Brightburn. And one of the people are, they think that they're like reporter, but they write as a journalist. So I think it's good that Breitbart is getting bigger, but I'm not supporting anybody with this, but it's really important to know both of the side story, I think. So,
well, and you bring up a good point, you brought it up earlier about credibility is the real damage of fake news or whatever we call it, that it's eating away. In fact, it's done a lot more than eat away at the credibility. So that next year, 5 years, when somebody does want to come, Trump or somebody puts stiff censorship laws or whatever, it's easy to do because most of America is like, oh, they're so corrupt anyway. It's all just.
But I think we shouldn't mistake balance for making up facts for a political agenda, because the problem is one of the issues that we're seeing is a lot of, I'm not going to use the term fake news, but a lot of the agendas that we're seeing are kind of in result of the immigration issue in Europe and the United States. A lot of it's a result of immigrants, and they're making up stories about immigrant criminality. And that has a very negative social effect for those people. It has a negative social effect for society at large because it's divisive.
Well, you were talking about, you just came back from Sweden,
yeah.
right? So
that's a good example.
It was a perfect example. So how did that go? Donald Trump tweets that there was just a terrorist thing in Sweden. The Prime Minister of Sweden immediately tweets and says, no, there wasn't. We didn't just have a terrorist attack.
Right.
But then what? The next week there was one.
Well, in 2015, they had a refugee crisis in Europe, and Sweden got like 160,000 migrants in like a matter of the late part of the year, so a couple of months. A large number of people came, Middle Eastern migrants mostly, and throughout since then. There's been an effort to say that there's this massive crime wave in Sweden and it's the rape capital of the world. None of that is true, but it did make its way to the mainstream media, starting with extremists, and then it gets on Fox News, and then Donald Trump mentions an event in Sweden that didn't happen, and then like I think a day or two later there was a riot in one of the suburbs, Rinkeby, and they pointed that to say, like, look, we proved, which is totally bogus. You didn't, there could have been a riot anywhere. You could have picked any country in the world and found a riot and said, see, we were right, But that's part of the problem. This attempt to attack refugees and asylum seekers is really, you could argue that you could probably trace it back to some Russian propaganda trying to divide and create chaos in Western societies, for sure. And then also, of course, there's the fact
PSYOPs.
psychological warfare,
That's right.
I mean, but then there's, of course, the fact that you have to factor in what is the negative effect for the people that are seeking asylum, So.
You had a question?
So, yeah, I expressed no
Sorry,
opinion.
yes, Mike. Yeah.
No worries. I expressed no opinion about the current administration, but lawyers in America for a while have been fighting the reputation of, they're ambulance chasers or they're corrupt or, they're all greedy and all about the money.
Talk about a credibility problem.
Right?
Journalists are just now experiencing what lawyers have had to deal with for years.
Forever, right? And so my question is, I understand that you can't control what happens in the world, but what responsibility do you have to protect your profession? Because, I mean, for a lot of my friends that are not as skeptical as I am, it's either black, white, red, yellow, whatever, and that's just their corner. And if you get it wrong once, then you're a liar. You weren't wrong, you lied. And so how do you protect your profession so that, just like lawyers, that we're not all thought of as ambulance chasers anymore, or the liars, or the all the terrible lawyer jokes, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking as a journalist, this is a key question, and you alluded to it earlier too. What are we doing to fight back? And because of corporate media, and which I spent years in, right, working for ABC and like big newspapers and Knight Ridder and so on. It's now all about the hit for a number of reasons, right? And it's all money. I think you're seeing, we're beginning to see the rise of independent media, right? Media that is not ad supported. Of course, we're now broke, all of us journalists that are trying to support that. But I'm not sure the tide can be turned around.
Well, I don't know. I think it can be. I think it's just a matter of journalists have to be, and news organizations have to be responsive to the public. I mean, I think, the New York Times and the Washington Post, I think, have done really well, covering, and the Wall Street Journal. I think they've done really well with their online subscriptions just because they've done a really good and aggressive job covering, the election and, the aftermath of the election and the Russia scandal. But it's really important for newspapers and news organizations to be credible. We have to be more careful. Like, it's more high stakes now. You can't make mistakes because you'll be accused of being fake news. But a good example is...
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, a good example is, just being able to cover communities and tell their stories. And yeah, it's... I think the tide can be turned around. I think it's the medium that's the challenge. So that's something that we have to figure out. When I was in newspapers, that was the challenge, and we all kind of had our problems there. But I think now that the medium has shifted, I think that there's a lot of reporters out there, and there's a void of information and a hunger for news. So,
yeah.
Do you think that good journalists are willing to call out?
that's what we do.
Yeah, that is what we do.
And this is the problem. If the traditional news media, say you work for a newspaper like I do, I have to write corrections every time I report inaccurate information, which fortunately doesn't happen that often, but it can happen.
We have competitors who just operate online.
Right.
They're not taken as seriously. You know, they can write anything. They don't. No one's gonna.
Yet they have
you know,
more reach.
Huh?
Yet they
have more reach. They probably don't get rich doing it, so they don't have any assets, so they don't get sued. Whereas the newspaper will get sued because there are assets you can seize. So there is a difference in terms of whether you're taken seriously or not, and there are different professional standards. I'm not quite sure people can still distinguish between the two. That's probably the problem.
Yeah, that's for sure. I was interviewing Vince Cerf. He's considered widely to be one of the inventors of the internet, right? He invented some of the Ethernet technologies that made the internet possible. And I said, do you have any regrets? And this was a while ago. And he says, yeah, I have a regret that we didn't ever consider how we could educate children and future generations that came on the internet to discern, truth from
That
falseness.
reminds me of a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier. I mean, how many people have heard, oh yes, Al Gore claimed that he invented the internet.
Yeah, he didn't claim that.
But, if you go back to the interview where that came from, he never used the word invented. And in the context of what he was saying, it was clear he was talking about, well, he was involved in legislative efforts to clear the path for the internet to get up and running and popularized, but that will never be out of people's heads. And there will be people who write to us who say they were watching the interview when he sat there and he said, I invented the internet, and he never said that.
Oh, I remember the interview.
I have to say that I'm kind of still dismayed with some even upper echelon journalism. Like, we're often accused of being too liberal, but I see, like, the Washington Post, for example, among others, maybe like about 3 weeks ago, and there was a whole issue with the press secretary, Sean Spicer, talking about the Holocaust and, the issue of was Syria gassing their own citizens, and he was very clumsy in what he said. He wasn't very artful, but it was kind of obvious the point he was trying to make, that, well, okay, even Hitler didn't launch gas canisters from airplanes on civilians. I'm not sure why that distinction was important, but it was clear he wasn't ignorant of what happened in the Holocaust and that people were rounded up into gas chambers, but that's the way the story came out, even in the Washington Post. Sean Spicer doesn't know that, about the Holocaust.
Back to that point about the journalists being for sure responsible for some of this fake news, because it's in the delivery of information, where things get skewed. And in addition to all the fake news that looks like journalism. You had a question for the longest time.
I do, yes. Can you tell me what legislation or penalties are coming down the pipeline to combat fake news, and how it will be enforced, especially globally?
That's a good question. Is there legislation pending around penalties?
Well,
I mean, there's always been...
In the U.S., it's like most other things. There's a lot of people talking about it and nobody actually doing anything. As I said, we have a lot of free speech issues that make people, politicians especially, don't really want to tread on that. There has been movement in Europe where they're sort of more stringent about that kind of thing, but those have been mainly, again, directed at trying to, say, penalize Facebook and Twitter for not taking down hate speech, not taking down, information that could lead to criminal activity or be politically harmful. But then again, it's going after the intermediary. You're trying to make Facebook or Google pay a fine, or Twitter or someone, not the people who are actually out there putting out the fake news, who are just going to find, one way or another to keep doing the same thing, or just keep pumping it out and let Facebook and Twitter deal with the consequences. So it's a very tough thing to legislate.
I've always wondered, maybe this is a question for all the lawyers in the room, I know there's a bunch, if there could be possibly a false advertising claim that could be made. So a site that's making lots of money, say, being paid for by a political candidate or something, that purposely puts out fake news or purposely makes it so lots of people share it and like it, can you make a false, because there are false advertising.
But they're not trying to sell you.
Well, I'm wondering if
anything
you
other
can
than an
take that and
idea.
twist it, because essentially they're advertising an idea that's false, or something. I wonder if there's a legal way around this where lawsuits might be the legislation.
It's that slippery slope of, how do you pursue that without, accidentally sweeping in legitimate media or speech,
Question, yeah.
He's not giving up the microphone, huh? Yes.
For sure.
If there are, Snopes to one established credible source that I will go to.
Yeah.
But how do you reach all the people and, the 40% of Americans who, I tell them I'm a journalist in Oklahoma and they go, oh God, you guys all just write fake stuff all the time. How do you reach them?
Well, one of the big changes that the internet has made in news is not just, as you said, the speed with which news moves and the way that news is reported, but it's also changed what is news, because the internet itself, what happens on the internet is news, as in someone posts on Facebook that, they went into a restaurant and they they were refused service because of the way they were dressed, because they had fatigues on or something. In years past, that would have been, okay, maybe that customer could have complained to the manager and his friends, and that would be the end of it. Now, it's like they post it on Facebook, and 20 minutes later, it's a headline in the New York Post, and everybody's writing about this one viral Facebook
Like
post.
the immigrant story we started with, 25 million shares and likes on that story
but
about
it's-
Obama and the Syrian immigrants.
But it's kind of like stuff that no one would ever have heard of or considered news is now news, and it's competing with space for real news that actually has an impact on people's lives. One of the points I often make is that when we're asked, how do we choose what to write about? And unlike some of the other sites that just cover only political
Like PolitiFact,
stories, yes,
of course.
we pretty much cover everything, and our standard is whatever the most people are asking about or searching on is what we cover. Unfortunately, what that means is we're doing a story about a fake picture that makes it look like President Trump had an attack of diarrhea on the golf course because millions of people are looking for that, whereas the issue of was this gas attack in Syria real? Was it launched by the government or someone else? There's a bare fraction of audience interest in that.
Yeah, that's the trick. And you talk about like Cronkite and these people, and I worked for Peter Jennings for so many years, and I often think, how would Peter have reacted to this?
Well,
if I would have said, oh, Peter, look, the Enquirer says that Elvis, is back and has mated with an alien, he'd be rolling his eyes. He would ignore it, which is what we did in the media. Is we ignored the Breitbarts and the red states and all of this for so long because we were used to ignoring tabloids and just kind of whatever. And now suddenly millions of people believe it.
The shift from journalists deciding what is news to the audience deciding what is news, which
Maybe that's the
some
core
peop-
problem.
Some people think is a good thing, like who are these ivory tower journalists to be telling us of what we should know about, but to
Who are
where,
those elitists?
where there's nothing that's not news, you know.
It's a question.
Sure, just a quick question on the future. If fake news as we know it today continues unabated, say for the next 25, 30 years, do you think it has the potential to actually change real history so that people 25, 30 years in the future looking back in 2017 and picking up fake news as if it is like the actual real historical record of what happened?
That's an excellent question, and I would say absolutely yes. So did you understand the question?
Yeah, but I would hope not. I think that just depends on, like, they say history is written by the winners. So hopefully legitimate journalism is the winner, and,
But when somebody 50 years from now or 100 years from now is like, they're doing a story of Podesta, John Podesta, and then they see, well, there was this whole thing, like millions of shares and likes and stories about him with the satanic spirit cooking rituals that were all over the place. It'll be like, well, many newspapers were reporting this, and Podesta never replied to it, right? He never commented. So that's what I'm worried about too.
But you already have the fake news and the real news. You have the president. So, and the news media has to report it. Yes, of course, they can try to debunk it, but they may not be able to.
yeah, that's a big problem. People have confused opinion and fact. They think that if they, want to believe something, then it's true. So
Yeah.
that is a major
Confirmation
problem.
bias, as you said. You have a
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, do you have a list of independent, credible news sources that could act as some kind of guide to people who are interested? I've seen a list somewhere that says, okay, this news source, maybe BBC, is more credible than this particular news source, and even if it...
There are such lists, and the thing
Yeah.
you showed us last night also,
We're
was that
usually-
your graphic that showed all the news media? Who showed me that last night, the cocktail party? All the news media on a continuum of left to right.
I know what you mean. It's not ours.
And there were these little online tools, right, that you install, like Chrome plugins, that whenever you're looking at any news feed, it like pops up like this is probably partisan, or this is probably state-owned, or
Of course, the problem-
demonstrably fake, or
The problem with a lot of ratings like that, where people try and create browser plugins or anything that rates sites, is that a whole lot of people who don't like what we fact check will then, enlist people to say that we're not credible and, skew the rankings. So we're usually working the other side of the street, making lists of things that are not credible rather than the ones that are. But
this could be a good service. I've always thought like to do a podcast or something that comes up every night, because there's always new media coming up all the time. And if you could constantly track, like here, and you guys already do that. Here's the fake news that came out today, and essentially, you guys have your news feed, which is awesome. Question. Oh.
There's a lot of this that have to do with personal preference. I mean, BBC, NPR, Washington, certain news sources that we know versus the sensationalism and the dumbing down of a huge amount of the population.
Well, we know they strive for accuracy, but they may not be reliable.
But, does the guy driving down I-95 and back in the morning down at night talking about that?
Yeah.
He's not going to turn to NPR.
Or all the millions of people who literally are just getting their news. They're looking at a Facebook feed. So there's an NPR story. There's a Washington Post story. There's a story from Red State or some Alex Jones or something. They're all mixed in, and they're not looking where did it come from. They're reading headlines and subheads.
Yeah, it's the confirmation bias.
Myself to NPR.
Yeah.
I trust NPR.
You can create a little bubble and live in your own reality right now.
Yeah.
And it's sensationalism and it's entertainment. So
Yeah,
And even they fall victim, like we were talking about how the NBC came out and like within 3 weeks of that the fake story about the immigrants, that they came out and treated it as if it were real. And for sure with Ashley Madison, you know, somebody floated that fake story that they might go public, and then Bloomberg and Forbes and everybody the next day reported it as if it was news. And there's a lot of figuring out to be done.
Yeah, I think that somebody asked, you know, what can you do to defend your profession? Well, I think journalists and news organizations and their editors have to be aware of the fact that the industry is under extreme scrutiny right now, and maybe slow down and don't try to be first, try to be right.
What is so disturbing is how much money CNN, for instance, made during the election. They had one of the most profitable years ever, and the way they were covering the election had never been done before. You had a candidate who was a reality show star. He came out of nowhere, and they were covering him as if, you know, he were, you know, an elder statesman of something constantly, because why? Everybody's hit-driven. And right now we're financially rewarding media for being like that. When Trump points at CNN or whatever and says, fake news, he's wrong that they're fake news, but he's right that the quality of news from them has, I mean, we used to be there too. We don't have the fact checkers we used to have. We don't have the attention to accuracy.
Big staffing issue. Yeah.
We don't have the bureaus like it used to be. There was an AP bureau in every little podunk town, and, you know, where are the bureaus for the national media? Go ahead.
Isn't the real issue that news and advertising are two incompatible things?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, they are. They should be.
You know, it used to be now, so I'm old, but in the 80s and the 90s when I worked at big media companies, we weren't even allowed to speak to the people who were in ad sales.
Same.
Like we often didn't even know where in the building they were, and if somebody see us like after, like at a bar or something, and I'm hanging out with like a salesperson, my editor would come to me and say, "Don't hang out with them. You should have no knowledge whatsoever." And now we call that the Chinese wall.
The wall, yeah, because when advertising, people would show up in editorial, people would be like,
That's right. Yeah, but now the reporters are being rewarded for hits.
the line is very blurred. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's getting worse and worse. You know, I was an internet reporter in the early '90s. I mean, I was a reporter covering the fact that the internet was going to be coming, and we'd always do these panels, and there'd be always someone. I told you this last night. Always someone on the panel who would say, "Oh God, when everybody can do their own channel, and when there's 100 channels and not just 12." It's going to be a mess, and there will always be corporate media, like the people I worked for at the time, Disney, which owned ABC or GE, and they would say, "No, it'll be great. Narrow casting, people will get just what they want." But people saw this coming and did nothing to stop it.
It's kind of like trying to put the genie back in the bottle. Like right now, if you have cable television, you can probably watch golf all day long if you want, nothing but golf. And are you going to let anyone convince you, you know, you should be watching other TV shows, not just golf? It's not good for you. It's kind of the same thing. How can you convince people you shouldn't get all your news from MSNBC or Fox? It's not good for you. You should be watching these other shows.
See, this is why it may not be fair, but it should be, I think, incumbent on the people like Facebook and Twitter and Google, the ones who are enabling the 25 million likes to that crazy immigration story, right? Like on its own, that story was just a satire story.
The question though is like, do they have the capability? I think maybe Facebook more so, but I was talking to a computer science expert last night who said Twitter doesn't really have the capability of doing that. And so that to me raises the question because from my understanding is before the election, the Russian measures were to start things on Twitter, forcing trends by using bot networks, which are automated profiles, basically.
And the trolls.
The trolls, too, yeah. So, but the problem is that, so then the question becomes if a foreign actor can use Twitter to influence events in the United States, and Twitter doesn't have the capability to stop it from happening, then the question becomes, like, should there be some kind of legislation? Should the government step in some way? I mean, that's a really, kind of scary question to ask, So it's like...
if Twitter doesn't have the money to do this and the staff, could you force them to do it?
Twitter has the money. Well, Twitter, I guess you're right. Twitter doesn't make any money, does it?
That's the issue that was raised with the person who's a computer scientist, is they don't have the resources to, create the barrier necessary.
Yeah,
So-
we saw in the report that came out from the Director of National Intelligence about how the Russians were ready to launch, assuming that Hillary Clinton had won the election, sort of a Twitter storm with the hashtag democracy RIP to kind of sow the confusion that the election wasn't on the level and, this isn't actually a fair democracy like we claim. And of course, they didn't have to unleash it because of the actual results, but it was waiting to go.
Cold War psyops have never ended.
Well, that's the thing, yeah, the Cold War never, so if you ask people that have been following the Russia scandal, they'll say that this is just a continuation of the Cold War, yeah.
There was a question there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was thinking you were over there.
Are fake news an issue for the audience or for the journalists? Because I have the feeling the journalists lost their monopole of interpretation. And it is very hard for them, with their own job description, that they lost this right. They were always teaching the people. They had the right. For example, you talked about the refugee crisis in Sweden. It's an immigration crisis. It's not refugees.
Yeah.
20% are refugees. 80% are immigrants. So you are also, when you quote this announcement, also fake news for other people. So for me,
it's a choice of words.
Yeah.
Well, there was a refugee crisis in Sweden. They had 163 people cross the border in late 2015.
And you also said migrants.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Refugees are from
Yeah,
Syria.
that's what he means.
I meant asylum
It's a
seekers,
huge,
yeah.
no, we have three different groups. We have asylants, we have refugees, we have immigrants. It's a huge difference. But all the journalists, also from the very credible medias, every time said refugees. Over 90% are male coming. But in all the news, you could also only see families.
Women and children, yeah.
So for me, it's more important, do we really need journalists with the interpretation anymore? Or do we just need a platform of reliable, not interpreted news? And
All C-SPAN all the time. That's awfully dry, though.
I rely much more on the common fields at the moment, not on the article anymore.
I mean, the reason for journalism and how it started, why there's a constitutional amendment is because there needed to be a watchdog on government, right? Because otherwise government...
Right. I mean, I don't understand. So you're saying because I use the word immigrant as opposed to refugee, there should be no more journalists?
No. He's saying, he's saying, do we really need journalism? Yeah.
You have not to be integrated into a society. During the wartime, for example, in Syria,
Yeah. Yes. Well, it's true. I mean, at least here in the United States, I don't know about elsewhere, but in the public's eye, yes, they tend to conflate asylum seekers, refugees, legal immigrants, illegal immigrants. They're all just lumped together as these are people who are coming to our country from somewhere else, and they don't really make or understand the distinctions. So that happens a lot. And as you say, the rules are different depending on whether you're a legal immigrant, a non-legal immigrant, a refugee. But again, it tends to get lumped together in people circulating stories about, look what Syrian refugees are getting from the government, $2,000 a month or something. And,
Right.
He's making a point that you guys made, that you made, that she made in the back, which is no matter how perfect journalism is still, somebody is still interpreting it and delivering it, and there is opportunity for all kinds of accidental or purposeful slant.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
But I don't think you want to
to
wipe out a watchdog
No.
function on the government
Journalists, I mean,
because of that.
yeah,
human
don't forget
failing.
that journalists are human beings and we make mistakes. Like, we're not, I never said that we were infallible, but I think that it's an important role, especially in a democratic and open society, because you have journalists whose profession it is to report, to, like you said, act as watchdogs, and to keep the public informed. The free flow of accurate and factual information is a central pillar of a democratic society. Do we make mistakes? We do, but we have to correct our mistakes. I mean, and you caught me. I guess I didn't. I don't even remember using the words interchangeably because I think that maybe the stories that we get here about the refugee crisis and asylum seekers, they use those words interchangeably: immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. And the stories that that are coming out of Sweden that sensationalize the crime also kind of conflate those things. But I mean, that's an important distinction for sure. But journalists are supposed, if they make a mistake, they correct the record. But to say that it's not, that you're just, you're a human being, so can anybody do it? Well, it takes a certain amount. There are ethics and standards, and then there's training and experience that factor into it as well. To expect somebody that works a full-time job and then to expect them to come home and figure out what the news is without somebody acting as a mediator and providing it to them, I think is a little bit, you're going to leave a black hole of information.
The first thing you do in a totalitarian regime is you blow up the radio station and close the papers. You
attack the media, yeah.
Yeah, because you don't want people to be able to speak. Our last question here.
Yeah, just to the point, I mean, just to find some bad reporting or inaccurate reporting doesn't justify getting rid of them. There's discussion in Germany that the media doesn't really reflect public opinion. Some of the views that are not as palatable, maybe, all the views that are against them.
I have so many relatives in Germany, and they're so angry about it.
Doesn't speak for us in very much the same way as in America. They say, well, the media is liberal. Oh, if you come from Europe and you look at the U.S. media, I don't consider any of them liberal. And so, but there is this feeling all over Europe that traditional media doesn't reflect this sort of part that is not as
I'm aware that our time with you is beginning to grind to a halt here. I wanted to see if we could, this is so damn depressing, I'm wondering if, we've already said we can't define it, we can't, change the integrity right now. There don't seem to be great ways or legislation or stopping or stemming fake news. So my question really is there a silver lining to any of this? Like you were saying, well, at least people are talking now.
Well, I think the silver lining to come out of it is that with the talk of so-called fake news, people are understanding the importance of credible news. I think that's important. The discussion over what is legitimate and what is not legitimate news is happening, whereas before it was more a matter of subjectivity, whereas now it's more objectively. People are actually saying this is, credible journalism, this is not, and your opinion, is your opinion, but there are facts that can be measured. So.
Yes, that's true. Do you have that? It's very hard for me to see a silver lining in any of this, unless it's that. Do you have one, David?
Well, we know the famous line.
Your business is booming.
This line about the best cure for bad speech is more speech. So if you hold to that philosophy, then we're on the right path, getting more information out there, but you could liken it to giving a drowning person more water to solve the problem.
Yeah, and maybe also, a year ago when I was covering the Ashley Madison stuff, I was like, people need to understand about native advertising and how this can move markets, and people don't understand it. I think after this election, a lot of Americans do understand that you can't trust everything you read, and they will be seeking answers and solutions, and maybe journalism will morph. I'm not sure. We'd love to keep up the conversation with you. Feel free to come up, say hi to them, get our business cards, and maybe we can all work together to do something. I want to thank you guys very much for coming here this morning. We will see you later.